So what we're going to do today is I'm going to set the stage. We're going to have a little bit of a chat working through this seven-step framework around creating a strategic revenue model. And then we're going to move into some case studies. And we're going to practice some of the concepts of the framework in these case studies. There's 2 of them. So I'm going to set the stage for how we're going to talk about the case studies and run the case studies. And then each of you have been assigned to a particular breakout room. So it's kind of random. And so at that point, around 10 a.m., if I'm lucky, a prompt will come up and you will simply select join the breakout room to which you've been assigned. Kim Nolte is going to lead one of the case studies. I'm going to lead the second. But really, the point of them is to get you thinking about the framework and experimenting on a scenario. And so in each of the breakouts, we're going to ask for a scribe, a person to take notes and be the reporter or auteur, if you will. And then we're going to come back together as a full group, and we're going to report out case study 1. Then we're going to move to case study 2, and we're going to have a discussion about those, right? And then we're going to wrap up with some Q&A. I don't want you to forget that we've got our Thursday open coaching hour. It will be with me related to this content. So that is our plan for today. So again, about 10 o'clock, we're going to move into case study rooms for a good time, about 20 minutes, and we're going to discuss, and then we're going to come back together. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to discuss first some changing conventions and assumptions that we have about the nonprofit sector and about revenue, and then talking a little bit about what's different about that in this time that we're in. We're going to discuss diversity of revenue sources and whether concentration or diversity is a stronger model. We're going to discuss drivers of what we're calling autonomy and reliability. Autonomy being revenue that allows a lot of latitude in how you are utilizing the dollars that come from that revenue that are what I'm going to call profit margin. And then the second is reliability, which is just how much can you count on the stability of that funding source. And then we're going to talk about the case studies and then talk a little bit about the role of messaging and accountability. So that is our game plan for today. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about kind of our conventional wisdom in nonprofits, stereotypes about nonprofit revenue. And I'm going to start, and I want to invite you to chime in with me about some stereotypes that you see. So the first, is we hear a lot about is that funding diversity is important. It's the holy grail. You have to be diversified in your funding. You have to have a very diverse portfolio of funding. So, individual donors, some foundations, perhaps some government, an event here and there, that kind of thing. That concentration is bad. To have a diversified, even if it's a diversified portfolio of government funding, too much government funding, bad, right? Another kind of stereotype, I'm just kicking us off here, is that low overhead is good. You really shouldn't, invest money in things like, outside of programs. It really, the majority of your money should go to programs and that kind of thing. And what we also hear is there are too many nonprofits. There's just not enough money to go around, right? So those are some of the ones that come to my mind. I'm wondering if you have some that you might think of that are kind of what we might term stereotypes or conventional wisdom. Anybody unmute and have at it.
Hey, Kim, this is Jonathan. Morning, everybody. Um, Not sure if this is a super common one, but maybe at least for fundraising revenue that the best you can swing it, maybe the more general operating support is better just for that flexibility. Um,
Right.
might not always be true, but just to be able to have that flexibility and reporting and be a little more nimble sometimes.
Got it. Okay. Anybody else?
Karen, I get a lot of comments from staff internally. I'm the director of development with Prevent Blindness Georgia. I get a lot of comments about the USA Today, and not USA Today, the charitable giving US report that says, you know, money comes from individuals. And so the fact that our balance isn't heavily reliant on individual gifts, but is reliant primarily on other things is wrong, or it is bad, and that we should have more individual giving and less foundation and corporate giving. The other thing that I get a lot of staff comments and judgment about is that you know, we have some donors, several businesses that are incredibly invested in what we do, and that give frequently and significantly, and
Right.
non-fundraising staff members will always say, oh no, we should be working hard on diversifying our corporate support. We shouldn't go back to the same people all the time. And I'm like, are you kidding? You know, these are the people who love us. These are our best donors. Of course, we're going back to them over and over and not spending time and energy on donors that have no linkage or interest in what we're doing.
Right. Right. Those are good. Those are good examples. Anybody else?
There's one also, Karen, that we often believe the hype of is that all money is good money, and that you have to go after every single dollar out there, no matter how close or far it is from your mission. We think we have to keep going after every dollar that's there, and not really look at the ROI on our time spent just chasing those dollars.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? I'm going to reopen this PowerPoint because there's something going on with subtitles, as y'all could see. What about endowments? Who has heard, like, you know, we need to have some kind of endowment over here, or we're not, you know, we're not doing a great job.
The
Anybody?
flip side of having worked at organizations with an endowment is donors don't love to give to you when you have an endowment. They say, why do you need my money? You have that huge endowment just sitting there for you.
Right. That is something I have heard as well. Anybody else? Conventional wisdom? All right. I'm going to share back my screen and we are going to continue on. Those are really good. So, you know, what we're going to talk about today is a little unconventional, which is why I wanted to kind of tease those out from you. And we really need to think more strategically about our revenue, and you're gonna learn a little bit why. And some of these conventional kinds of ways have been sort of passed down like folklore over and over and over again. And, you know, kind of what I want to talk a little bit about is that revenue is really an individual organizational thing. Your relationships are yours. They're not another organization's. They're strong or they're weak, right? Your capacity is your own. You have different talents on your staff that can do different things. And so whereas you may be able to capture a certain revenue source because of that talent or that capacity or who you know, or kind of what your organization particularly does is is your superpower. It's not necessarily another's. And when we're thinking about strategic revenue, we need to be exactly that, strategic. We need to think about the costs of generating that revenue. We need to think about all of the different opportunities that we have that are uniquely our own, and what capacity we particularly have to get those. Just following some kind of folklore, like you need to have this mix or this or whatever, can really cost you a lot in terms of missing an opportunity because you're so distracted trying to put together this, almost like what people say around a investment portfolio. You need to have all this blah, 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 when maybe you don't. Maybe concentration is really good. And there's been some recent and really fine research done on this by Bridgespan Consulting and others. In our cohort sort of SharePoint site, we're going to put that research along with some common revenue models that'll help you kind of dig in a little bit deeper and think about the different kinds of revenue models and typical types of nonprofits that go after them. But creating a revenue model is thinking about the potential universe of funding accessible to your organization and making strategic decisions about preserving what you have, increasing kind of that area of the pie, or expanding revenue into a new area that you're not in already. It's not the same as creating a year-to-year budget. So I get that everybody's sort of saying, these are my costs and this is what I need to raise and all of that. It's really thinking, it's a part of your business plan for your organization. And there are, anybody that's been through business school, particular revenue models that kind of work. Like there's a subscriber revenue model. We're on Zoom right now. That is a subscriber revenue model, right? They're trying to increase subscriptions and increase the number of people in particular subscriber verticals. Like you have the enterprise vertical, you have the folks like us that need more functionality, and then you have just a simple user that wants to have Thanksgiving virtual meal with mom and dad, right? And so that is a subscriber model versus something else, which might be like like McDonald's. A lot of people think that their main business and revenue model is actually selling hamburgers. It's not, it's actually real estate. And so that's how they grow their assets. So every business has a particular revenue model, and so nonprofits should as well. And it is not the same as creating a budget. It drives your budget, but it is not the same. It starts, and this is the most critical foundational component of revenue model creation, is it starts with an understanding of your true cost of services and your true costs of raising whatever capital you are raising, whether that is managing an endowment and paying all the investment advisors, or whether that is creating an event and running that event and all of the direct costs of that, but also the indirect costs of that, and really understanding what those look like. So that is number one. So we assert that revenue diversity is the wrong starting place, right? Just thinking like, I've got to have this pie chart that's all balanced is not the right starting place for thinking about a strategic revenue model. The positive aspects of diversity, and there are some, is that it does moderate the ups and downs of cash. If you have a balanced portfolio model, that's actually a plus on that, if it's working. The second is larger dollars are delivered by adding funders or sources. And it could be a proxy for growth that board members understand. When you're saying, oh, we're getting more and more diverse, right? It's a proxy for success that they get versus some of the negatives of diversity, which is it often raises overhead costs related to managing and soliciting funds in these different buckets, right? So let's take the example of an event. We're going to have a very specific example in a minute of earned revenue, but events costs, it's a very straightforward example, because if you think, and many nonprofits do, well, we need to add a bucket of revenue source, and an event seems like a good way. We can get a lot of folks from the public in or our volunteers, and make some money on this auction and the tickets and whatnot. But what they fail to understand, and it might be the right choice, but what they fail to understand often is all of the different costs that come into that. It's not just the renting of the venue or, the food and all of that. It's your staff time related to that. And it can often eat up months and months of staff time and distract you from kind of other kinds of things. Now, it may be the right thing for you to do, but it may not be if you don't have that capacity. And then, so the bottom line is that each funding stream brings new tasks and task managers in terms of, or task masters rather, who do you have to report to on governmental grants? What is the accountability required of that? All of those things are task masters because you can't get out of doing them once you accept the funds. Does that make sense? Okay. So the real drivers of stability in terms of revenue are two things. It's reliability and it's autonomy. And I want to talk about that for a minute. So reliability, what do we mean? It's the predictability of operating revenues for cash flow management, right? So you could have a source, let's say of let's just say government money, and it could be very predictable in terms of, we get this contract for 200,000, it has an X admin rate, and, we understand how, what we are to deliver with that and how we are to deliver that impact. And we are comfortable with the amount of money that it requires for management and accounting and reporting and all of that kind of thing. So that's that could be a predictable source versus I'm going to XYZ Foundation and, they many of y'all have heard some foundations do 1 year of money and then you have to wait for a period of time before you can reapply. That's not a predictable or reliable source of money, right? So predictable sources of funding can fuel growth and maybe innovation. So we're going to put a pin in that because we're going to talk a little bit more about it. The second sort of area is autonomy. What do I mean by autonomy? Well, it's to the degree to which your revenues are flexible to be, redeployed as necessary. So earned revenue comes to mind on that if you do it right. It should have some kind of profit margin. It is unencumbered by a report that I need to make to a governmental source other than my tax return. It is, it becomes sort of general operating when it comes in the door to be deployed as the board and the staff strategically decide. Does that make sense? So that's what we mean by autonomy. Flexible money can fuel innovation and growth, and it can also fill in gaps. You can understand that this particular, endeavor that we're doing is spewing a margin that perhaps this endeavor over here is not, but it's more mission centric, that mission money matrix, if you will. And I can plug that hole with that money, and or everything is, sort of covering itself, and whatever money I get from that earned revenue endeavor is going into maybe an endowment that we're starting for ourselves, or maybe it's going into buying a building, or maybe it's going into funding, internal infrastructure like accounting staff or HR staff or whatever we need. So reliability and autonomy, I need you to remember that, because when you're putting together a revenue strategy, these two things are extremely important, not necessarily just diversity, if that makes sense. So when we think about autonomy, just want to dig into that a little bit more. This is sort of, one way of looking at it. We have our axes here where my cursor is going up and down, right? And so down at the bottom here, we have what we call pure giving. And then at the top here, we have pure investment, pure nonprofit, more, just altruistic. And then here, there's a profit motive to what we are looking at. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, but, we can see down here, small individual gifts, pure nonprofit, pure giving, there's rarely sort of, give me your giant report for my $50 gift that I'm giving you on the annual report, right? There's not that. So that's down here. And then as we move up kind of the spectrum, we have, I'm just going to pick off something in the middle here, like a fee-based service, like let's say a training course or something like that, where, there are expectations to that, but any margin that is produced on this fee-based service can be more and more, can be used as a very flexible source of dollars, right? We have the dollars used to deliver the source, or deliver the training rather, and then we have the dollars that are the margin that really are general operating at that point. We can use them for reinvesting in mission, or I could use them to, again, fund a position that I wanted, or upgrade my technology, anything. And it moves on into the spectrum of like mission investment or social impact bonds, which are more and more autonomous as you go. That's not to say there are not things that are required of them, but the dollars created by those, the margin created by those, are more and more autonomous. So when we think about creating a strategic revenue model, the trick of this is to kind of list, and we're going to put this in the tool set in the SharePoint site. So it's not like you have to create an Excel sheet. So it's in there for you to use. But, what are your sources? And you may have more than this, but I just kind of listed some here. You can certainly add to the Excel. What is the percentage of that to the total pie of revenue? And thinking through whether it is autonomous or whether it is reliable, could be a little of both. What the challenge does that pose? And then what's the opportunity there, sort of thinking through that. This is going to be some of the things that we work through in the case study, but this is a way to think about your revenue sources, and you need to kind of do that for each of the sources that you have. And a challenge, let's just put it in context. And again, we'll be going over this in the case study, but you could have government fundings, and, they could be, a lot of times government funding sort of incrementally declines is a good way to put it. So it doesn't necessarily all go away, but maybe the grant the next year is less, or it's more restrictive, or geographically, or whatever parameter they want to put on it. So that's an example of a challenge. An opportunity could be, it's increasing, and there's a focus at the federal level on that particular, kind of mission aspect that you do, and there's more opportunity to perhaps get larger grants, or even diversify into different government entities. So one of my arguments to donors that say, this particular organization has too much government money is it spread out among different types of departments, right? Because, HUD's not going to go away tomorrow, and the Department of Education is not going to go away tomorrow. They might, one or the other might cut, but if you're across several, or if you've got local plus federal, both are government, and you could present them that way, but they're diversified in a way. So the way to think about reliability and autonomy, and this is another tool that you can use, because you could actually take your percentages and challenges and opportunities. You can plot your revenue sources on this. So I can put government up here or over here, depending on the way I see it. But let's look at that. So when we're in this top level, over here, we have a highly reliable, see this over here, high, low, reliable, autonomy. A highly reliable a source that has a little bit lower autonomy. And the attribute of that is that it's a strong service. It's probably less innovative, and there's probably less growth potential over there. It's something that is almost on autopilot again. And I'm going to use a government source again. So perhaps you have a HUD grant and it's X amount to deliver the services, and you've got, like, let's say a 15% admin rate. So that 15% admin rate has got to cover, your accounting, your reporting, your whatever kind of shared services internally that you have going on to make that program work. So typically those kinds of grants are not releasing a lot of capital, if you will, that is not otherwise being utilized to just make the budget work, if that makes sense. You're paying for accounting or you're paying for that. I'm not saying that that's a hard and fast rule, but that is typically true. They have very low or no margin. They are a mission, kind of churning mission out, making your budget work kind of endeavor. So that is the characteristic of strong services. It would be less innovative, possibly less growth potential. We move to the right, we've got high reliability, high autonomy. Obviously, this is the sweet spot of where you really want to be. These are strong services. They have the ability to adapt, innovate, and grow. Earned revenue does come to mind here, social enterprise, something of that nature. Where we can count on, a market to purchase because we've done that research and we've got a brand and, all of the infrastructure built, and we've got a margin going on that is spewing capital into operating or innovation. If we keep going around the circle, we've got low or high autonomy and low reliability. And that characteristic of that is the ability to adapt to changes, but limited ability to grow, right? And then again, where we want to not be is in that bottom left, where we have low reliability and low autonomy. And that typically you can see that in people's revenue. If you find a really struggling nonprofit, they're in crisis operation, little resiliency to adapt, change, and no growth. You almost can't get out of the cycle unless you get an infusion of cash that helps you reinvent a revenue model that works for you. And we see that sometimes when people take on a new revenue model, maybe a revenue source like an event, and it costs a lot more money than they thought, and they're eating up their very low sources of capital over here, paying Peter or robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you get into a doom cycle on that a lot of times. Does that make sense? So this is a tool you can use to plot your current revenue sources and kind of where they fall in this model. So, while many revenues are possible, not all of them are feasible. So once you understand the reliability and autonomy of your current revenue, you really do need to kind of vet through. And I think that 4-box is a great way to do that. And one of the things to really know is that you could have an accessible revenue stream. You could have a foundation that came to you and said, we'd really like to fund this particular thing, but it's constrained by the organization's acumen, their capacity to execute, have the patience to see it through. Maybe I've seen a lot of donors that want to help an organization start an earned revenue source, and they're in it for the first part, but not for the duration. And those things really take a lot of patience and time to kind of come to fruition. So there's a lot of things you can do. We've talked about a few of them, but not all of them are feasible or something that you want to get into because it's invariably going to distract you from doing things that you want to do otherwise. So, let's look at an example of where, diversity is not necessarily the best thing. It earned revenue. So a lot of folks think earned revenue is sort of the holy grail of, and it can be a really great thing, social enterprise or earned revenue, right? And those two things are not the same either. So when does a social enterprise make sense? It makes sense when it aligns with the organizational mission and core values. We're not going to go start a bakery if we're not, if that doesn't make sense for what we're trying to achieve. I can understand that if you were trying to give folks some workforce development or something of that nature, but just if it's an elbow on the organization, not the best. It'll be a huge distraction. It makes sense if it leverages an asset or a capability that you already possess. Maybe you're doing some training, for example, or you have a competency in a certain area, and you think you can parlay that into, some revenue. If it addresses a defined but unsatisfied need and want in the community, and if it will generate a financial surplus or be financially stable. And again, if you have the acumen to plan it and the patience, because no business just starts out of the box like, oh, we're just super successful here. You have to have the patience to see it through. So these are some of the things when it makes sense. But earned income is not necessarily a social enterprise. There's other ways to leverage assets or capabilities, like renting extra space or setting up a sliding scale fee for service, or as we've said, providing training or consulting. And again, if you have the capacity to do it. So again, this is not something that, should be entered into lightly when you're looking at something. And we're just using earned revenue as an example here. You really have to understand all of the costs, not just the directs. Even like an example, like renting extra space, somebody in your staff administratively has to take those calls, has to take the money, has to be at the space, has to make sure the janitorial comes and cleans the space after that, has to deal with the client complaints. All of these things are things that are there, even if it's not like a giant social enterprise that we're all used to. So those costs are real. They are, as I said, both direct and indirect. It's the time to develop the concept. It's the requirements such as accountability and restrictions and reporting. We're getting into so much of that, by the way, with ARP funds from the government, where people, competed for those at a local level. They've gotten these government grants. They've never had them before. And suddenly they understand, oh, this is a reimbursable grant. I don't get all the money up front like I did into my foundations. I have to show the cost, reimburse. And by the way, while I'm waiting for that check to come in, I've got to pay my staff or my trainers or whatever it is that we were doing. And, I'm in cash flow crisis, right? So there is a cost to all of these things. And then let's not underestimate the cost of administration and leadership and the things that requires. So it is very important, like I said at the very beginning of this presentation, that you understand the current cost of what you have, but what you want to have. And that is even if you're expanding a certain source like foundations or individual donors or doing a social media campaign, it all requires that. So, there's a difference, as I said, when we're talking about the government grants around creating operating revenue, which pays bills. It's tied to the service provision. It manages income expense, sort of a budget in and out, versus creating investment capital, which is that sort of that margin that is produced so that you can invest in assets or invest in capacity. It's uncoupled from operations that can be set over here. So each of those is very important to understand. So, when we think about diversification, think about diversifying in proportion to your capacity. What works for your organization works for your organization. It's not, a hard and fast model. So, if we were to look at a pie chart example, which we're going to get more and more into here on our case study, we have an example here where we have some reliable government reimbursement, and it's 70% of this particular organization's revenue, but year in and year out, the government particularly needs those services to be performed. It's almost like an outsource by the government. If this organization remains competitive in terms of their price to the government and their capability to continue to be accountable and report and maintain their relationships, it seems to be a reliable source, and with a reliable operational margin. There's generally an indirect rate that you can qualify for or be approved rather, and those can range anywhere from 10% to 25% or above. And so that in this model, that's what they have there. And then they have autonomous, what we call small donations and events, which create autonomous revenue that they don't necessarily have to, is not encumbered, is just pure margin. And then they are also doing some sliding scale fee generation from clients. And that is relatively autonomous too, because those are either a break even or they are, in this case, creating a margin that they is also unencumbered by any particular program or accountability. So if you think about this revenue model a little more deeply, let's look at the gray and orange: small donations and events and sliding scale fees for, let's just say, a training class. Let's just use that as an example. So a class and an event are both events, right? So their event staff, they have the infrastructure from an event staff perspective, from a registration or, database perspective, likely from an accounting perspective, an individual donation versus, a ticket, very similar in terms of how you might handle those from an accounting standpoint. They're not having a lot of specialty, one-off staffing needs or consulting needs there. They're very, the models there are very consistent. And so you can have a model efficiency here that, that makes sense. And I'm going to stop there. Does that make sense? Can everybody give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down around, how we're thinking about those internal costs and how they might drive an efficient model of revenue generation? So that's something you want to think about. So the bulk of what they've got from an internal capacity standpoint is obviously pointed here. It's reliable. We know it. We know how much we can increase it or what the decrease is going to be, who the relationships are, what it takes to do it. Here, we have a fairly consistent model. They're different things, but the underlying, what I need from a capacity standpoint, accounting, et cetera, are very similar to one another. And so it's creating an efficient model. A plan for revenue model that isn't written is really just an idea, and you're not going to drive a lot of discipline at your organization. And particularly if you're trying to transform your revenue model, it needs to be written down. And just like your strategic plan needs to be written down, and you need to have annual objectives around that. And those aren't just for the dollar amount, that's for the internal capability to drive increasing amounts of that particular revenue that you're trying to go after. So if you're trying to increase your small individual donors, certainly there should be a target, but there should also be internal process types of objectives and goals and capabilities put into place. And, if you're not not fully kind of staffed up for that, maybe that starts with contract and some low level technology, and then transforms as you're, growing that particular revenue source. It needs to be like a decision-making guide, because I don't know about y'all, there's always an opportunity that comes up. And so it's weird to say no to revenue, but if it means that you're going to be taken down a path that is not going to double down on what is going to work, it's just opportunistic, and it's going to get you into that cycle of higher cost than you can imagine and distraction. And then it can be used as an engagement tool for investment seeking. We're going to talk about that in just a second. I promise I'm almost done with this, by the way, too, but we're going to get into the fun part. So communicating your plan, a lot of folks might just do this internally, but I have an argument that I think informing stakeholders and current donors of your plan for revenue, strategic revenue generation or transformation is a really good thing to do. It's not always comfortable, but it is a great thing to do, because it just makes you a little more accountable, a little more transparent than you might be comfortable with, but it comes across as a strategic conversation with your donors. And a lot of times you'll uncover donors that want to get involved in that. They're already supporting you. They want to maybe help you continue on that path to transformation. And so many times you can uncover a bigger gift or somebody that will say, well, I know I've been funding this program, but I really understand what you're trying to do from a capacity standpoint, so you can do more of the program I care about. I will invest in that component. And that could be, helping you pay for a database, helping you pay for a staff member that's going to go after a new source of revenue, or, there's a million examples of that. But we find pulling investors together and really articulating the revenue model that's going to work and what you need from them sometimes actually creates bigger gifts or direction to somebody that might be otherwise an investor and they may never have told you about. And then, of course, we want to implement, monitor, and adapt. And developing this is easy, but it's hard to stay focused when there's different opportunities. I just used that example of the ARP funds. A lot of people just went after it because it was dollars, and I get it, but there's a lot there to be concerned about if you don't have the capacity to really manage a government source. And that's just one example, but you have to literally lead your revenue model. So so that is the steps.
All right, friends, how's everybody doing? Everybody's on mute.
We are great.
I think we got everybody. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Oh no. How do I get back to that slide? Previous. Okay. We need a scribe for this session who will kindly volunteer to be able to take notes or pay attention and then report back.
I'm happy to do it.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. Okay, why don't we go over what we got here for our case and then start thinking about what are our best suggestions for this organization. Okay, so our agency is not direct service, but rather offers coordination and capacity services for a consortia of human service agencies in a major city, and it's struggling with growth. They're covering basic operations and the cost of programming, but cannot seem to generate enough free cash flow to invest in strategic staffing that would help them grow. As their consultants, what strategic steps would you recommend that they consider to create a stronger revenue model? All right, so let's see what they got. They have 3 government contracts that were incrementally cut over several years, creating a gap between revenues and true cost of services. It's reliable, but shrinking. They have two have low autonomy and 1 fairly high autonomy. So there's some government restrictions there, but 1 has some autonomy. The executive director does all the fundraising, and the board is sporadic in their support, 60% give. There's no development staff at this organization. There's 9.5 FTEs and 13 staff. The salaries have been flat for 2 years. Benefits are PTO, $200. I don't know what Pref Dev is, and 75% of insurance, health insurance premium. The foundation proposals have not scored well. There are more unfunded than funded proposals, and they're often losing out to the basic needs. When available, the funding from foundations was not very autonomous. There's a volunteer pool of over 100 and about 1,200 clients per year. They're never asked to donate beyond passive mailers. There's a fee for service in community training. When it's done, it generates profits most of the time. All right, let's go on to just what the mix is. So here's the type of funding that they have. So 74% is government funding, 6% donations, 4% fee for service, and 16% is the foundations. And remember, they're putting in more proposals than what they're winning. So here's what we're charged to do. Let's think about this nonprofit scenario. We could add more to the story if we want. Let's talk about a list of opportunities and challenges that the agency faces and develop a strategy of how we would change that pie, the 74%, 6%, 4%, 16%, and develop a rationale to support that strategy. We need to look at the steps that the agency should pursue to position themselves to change their funding mix. So what do they need to do if they were to up certain areas and decrease certain areas? How would you communicate the plan to the key stakeholders? And what would you monitor and how? So why don't we go back? We'll take a look again. 3 government contracts that are getting cut. There's some reliability, but it's shrinking. 2 have low autonomy, 1 high. You got an executive director that does all the funding, the board's sporadic, no development staff. Benefits are mediocre. Foundation proposals not scoring well. Volunteer pool and clients, not really asking much of them donation-wise beyond the mailers. They've got a fee for service, and when they do it, most of the time it generates profits. All righty. Let me know if you need to see anything else. I'll flip between the 3 slides if you want. Just let me know what you need. Once you all come off mute, and let's see, what are you thinking? What stands out for you?
My first thought is it seems like they need a person on staff who has more focus on developments. If the funding proposals are not doing well and there are very limited direct asks, it seems like that might need to be added to someone's job, or I'm not doing great here, so people can feel free to chime in. But does that mean, I don't know, do they need a capacity building grant so that they can hire a person? They clearly don't seem to have the funding to increase existing salaries, so that feels like they don't have funding to hire someone. But can those jobs be shifted so there's someone who can put more of their time and energy to focusing on refining their asks and encouraging board giving?
I agree. No, I agree. That was the first thing that stood out to me, is that there's no development staff, especially with their funding, their proposals, most of their proposals not being awarded. And looking at the pie graph with the government funding decreasing, and it's the largest portion, looking at there is an increase, looking at there could be an increase in foundation funding if they could get at least 1 person on, to be in development that could focus on bringing in those funds.
I agree. Absolutely. They need to bring in someone with development who is a grant writer and it makes a difference if someone knows how to fill out grants and really can be a specialist in that. But they also need to change their board. They need the board more involved, and the board have 100% giving.
There's also a lot of room for growth in that individual. They're not asking their stakeholders to donate and not able to really reach out to that part of their community very effectively. And that kind of, I think, goes back to the needing someone on staff who can do it. If you've got the ED who's kind of trying to do everything and probably knows what needs to be done, but doesn't have the capacity to do everything well, that's just going to be overstretched and leaving a big funding source untapped.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. It seems like they're not really looking in how to make the most of, it said, I think 1,200 clients. So if it's not effective with mailers,
Let's see.
find a more effective way to leverage. Find a more effective way to leverage that pool. Something that can really be more appropriate for, yeah, passive mailers, something that's more appropriate and effective to get buy-in from them and to be able to increase giving.
It's hard to know what the staff is doing. I mean, since you know that you've got like 13 people, some of them part-time to equate to the 9.5 FTEs, and how that might be shifted to have someone else on staff, either some of the people, more than one person having some additional duties, or one person shifting to only being responsible for development. But it's hard to know without really having a little bit more background in there as to are those people already stretched to the nth on what they're already doing, and if so, is it time to step back and build capacity a bit with more funding, and then being able to reach out with increasing your services?
Yeah, so Becky, since we don't know, that might be the area where we can embellish. Right. We can just make up that scenario.
We can say, they'll have time to do this, or it'll be a good investment to have someone do this instead, because that's clearly what's needed, is somebody who can focus on bringing in some revenue.
Right, where you can
outside
say,
of the
Mary,
government
she's so
contract.
good with running that volunteer program and she knows everybody. We can have her making those individual phone calls, and she's so eager to learn some new skills.
Right.
I think that $200 that says perf dev might be professional development.
Yeah, I think you're right. $200 towards professional development.
So we can
really isn't
encourage
much.
people to use some of their professional development to build some development skills.
Ah,
I totally agree. It definitely stuck out to me that they're not tapping their current volunteer and client base like we already talked about, to see if they can. These are obviously people who are invested or invested in the mission or have experienced benefits from the mission. And so definitely tapping those people more closely to donate seems like a more autonomous stream of funding as well. And it does say that their fee for service community training, when they do that, is mostly profitable. So I think they could also look at increasing either the number of times that they charge a fee, or coming up with a sliding scale model to sort of tap, like, I don't know what percentage of the 1,200 clients per year get charged the fee and what don't, but they could look at expanding that as long as it didn't decrease their ability to serve most people.
well, and they're not. It says, on the little bullet points on the left side, the agency is not direct service, but offers coordination and capacity services with human service agencies. So those 1,200 clients per year are those organizations that they're working with, or individuals at agencies?
That's something that was sticking out to me, especially when it came to the foundation proposals are not scored well. Maybe there's a problem with communicating what they actually do. There could be a messaging issue there.
Right.
So I think streamlining messaging could be something to take a look at.
And if that's something that the ED is responsible for, as well as the fundraising and the overall operation of the organization, then that's just adds to that stretch of ability to execute as well as it should be done.
I think another aspect is capturing data or metrics. What is the impact? Need to know how is their money going to be used and how many people are going to be impacted, and just the metrics are important.
Right.
They need to bring in other avenues of fundraising, because if the government grants are being cut every year, then perhaps they need to look outside of government grants and see what other type of fundraising and find other revenue streams.
What are you thinking about other streams?
Well, if we knew what kind of an organization it was, it would be easier to figure this out. I would like a little more information, but they're not going after individual donors. Are there any corporate donors that they could go after? They could add that to their list.
You know, the other thing is this fee for service, right? When it's done. So it seems like that's inconsistent and it generates profits most of the time. Seems like it needs a little more of a focus there, right? So how much are they getting from fee for service? Oh, it's small, it's 4%.
Is it even worth their time and energy at the way it's being performed right now? Do they need to revamp the entire program?
Right.
For the fee for service? Because what impact are they having? How difficult is it to do that service?
Yeah, could the resources that are being applied toward doing that and consistently be applied toward trying to increase donations with a fundraising campaign, a donor or individual giving campaign, or reaching out to more corporate as well as foundation donors?
So we sort of have two, basically, I think we all agree that they should look more closely at the community trainings and either refine the model and do more of them so they're more effective, or refine the model and do fewer of them so they're not detracting staff time for something that is of minimal impact. And it could be that, I mean, if we're viewing ourselves as consultants and making recommendations, I mean, that's a pretty strong recommendation to analyze the functionality of those and go one way or the other. And it also can be tied into this other point that somebody, I don't remember who, brought up about messaging, that perhaps they need, or they need to think about more succinct and clear ways of explaining who they are, what they do, what their impact is, folding in those impact numbers. And is that part of the community training? Is part of the training messaging and explaining to the stakeholders what value they're adding, which would in turn potentially increase both attendance and possibly future engagements from those trainings. So I think it's really interesting that we're kind of in a place of where we say you could kind of go either way with these trainings, either do a lot more of them or do none of them, depending on how you decide they're working for you and your staff is working. And I think we all agree, suspicious is not the right word, but something like they have a lot of staff for someone who's not a direct service. So is that staff being used well? Do they have a lot of staff spending a lot of time on a few number of trainings? When we all agree also, they need one or two development people, or people at least with development in their portfolio of responsibilities.
And communications as well. I mean, there's really no talking about communications in here and who might do that, but that seems to be lacking too, is that both someone, I know communicating and developing are kind of interrelated, and in a very small place, it's the same person who does both, or the same people, same small team that often does both, but that's, that really needs building up too. You sending out one mailer, just a passive mailer and no other communications and donor asks is really weak.
And with their training, what is their actual cost of the training? With the person who, what it costs to put on, what is their overhead part of it? And what is their profitability of it? How are they looking at that? Because if you don't have a profit there, do you need to do it?
So we're actually at our 20 minutes. And I just gave a heads up to Karen. So I think we're going to need to consolidate our thoughts right now and just kind of come up with some bullet points. Let's just look at the last slide of talk about the opportunities and challenges, identify the steps that the agency should pursue to position themselves to change their funding mix. How would you communicate the plan to stakeholders? How would you monitor? What would you monitor and how? So I think we came up with some great opportunities and challenges. Let's get some steps together.
Yeah, I think based on my notes, I think that our first two steps, one is to do an analysis of the way that staff time is spent to determine how those responsibilities can be shifted to include some development roles, advancement, or more broadly advancement, including communications and volunteer coordination in there. The second is an analysis of this community training model, its effectiveness, its profitability, its usefulness as a messaging and training tool. Because I think we all agree that we need to shift the model to include some more individual gifts and more foundation gifts, as well as more fee-based gifts, or that from that sliding scale model. And we need to have the staff to support those changes, and they can kind of go. I think we also agree the fees can either increase or go away depending on how the staff divvies up those responsibilities.
We also can look for corporations in addition to the individual donations.
Do you want to give a stab at percentage of revenue in the different categories?
Could you go back to that pie chart?
Yeah.
It definitely increased the donations slice, maybe at least to 15%, 15 to 20%. I'm just saying stuff.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Maybe we say we think the government percentage should go down to 50%. Does that feel comfortable?
Yeah. If they can get more effective at their grant or foundation applications, like maybe they could grow that from 16% to like 25 or something, or 20.
And they'll definitely need a skilled grant writer, right? Because they're wasting their time right now losing, right? So they've got to have somebody who knows what to do in order to increase their hit rate and get it up to 20% or 25%.
One of the things we didn't really even touch on was that those government grants, the amount of time, 2 of them were pretty onerous as far as the accounting and the work that needed to be done around that. So when you cut, if you're looking at trying to cut back and use that staff more effectively, it does lean toward reducing that to more like 50%. And when you first said 50%, I thought, that's a really big cut, but maybe that's appropriate.
Yeah, maybe that's where we get the staff time back to put their energy in other places. It is a big cut. I mean, this imaginary organization is probably not happy with us.
So maybe it should be, so it's 50% government, 25% foundations, maybe it's foundation / corporate, right? Combination.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 75, donations said 15. So that brings us to 90, 10% fee for service.
Sure, I think we can say that, and part of our narrative is it's potential that the fee for service will actually be less, which would mean more energy towards some of the individual or corporate fundraising. But
oh, that's right. We don't have donors in there. We don't have the donations at all, the individuals. So
yeah, I thought we had that at 15%.
oh, sorry, it is at 15. Sorry.
This is a difficult thing to talk about until they're in a better funding position, but I also think that they're at risk of employee burnout and attrition because their salaries have been flat. They're mixed of, I don't remember their exact mix. I think it was 9.5 FTEs to 13 staff. But like their strategic staffing, like if they're trying to grow strategically, they have to invest in the employees that are willing to and have the capacity to think strategically. So I guess they need to start with a few key people in order to get their funding more in line. But then if they really want to grow, they have to get some more autonomous funds so they can invest in their employees.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and if we were real consultants, I think we would say you might not be able to increase salaries, but what are some ways you can take care of your staff right now in these changes and help give them hope for future stability and future growth?
Yeah.
All righty, we're down to our last 30 seconds. Any last words?
We haven't really talked about what we would measure. And I don't know.
Good point. We'll just admit that we didn't do it.
Or how we would communicate to stakeholders, but I think everything we laid out is what you communicate.
Thank you for that.
We were finishing up.
Okay.
All right, we got everybody back.
Everybody back. So I hope y'all had a good discussion. We certainly did. What we want to do is do a little debrief. And so what I'm going to do, Kim, is share my screen. And just because we were in group 2 and you're in 1, we don't really know your case study. So just really, we're going to quick kind of recap what the case study was. I'm going to share my screen there. And then have your group kind of talk about their discussion and where they came to, and then we're going to do the same for the second case study. So let's look at that. Let's look at that first case study real quick. Let me pull this PowerPoint up, get back to Zoom and share my screen. There we go. And so case study 1 from my group, this was an agency that is not direct service. They are not like feeding people, but rather they're offering more like coordination and capacity services for a consortia of human services agency in a major city. struggling with growth. They're covering basic operations and the cost of programming, but can't seem to generate enough free cash flow to invest in strategic staffing that would help them grow. And we're coming up with recommendations. So as you can see, they've got 3 government contracts. They've been incrementally cut over several years. They're reliable, but they're shrinking. And 2 have low autonomy, meaning there's a lot required of them to maintain them, and 1 is fairly high. They have an executive director that does all the fundraising, and the board is very sporadic in their support. And they're kind of a mid-sized organization with about 10 FTE, but they've got some part-timers. And offering some benefits, but probably not at the most competitive level. They have foundation efforts, but they're not doing well. They're not really successful a lot of the time in that. And when they are getting them, they're not autonomous. There's a lot of requirements related. They do have a big volunteer pool and a large client pool, but they've not really asked or leveraged those. And they've got a little bit of fee for service, and it does generate profits. It's fairly successful when they choose to do it. This is what their revenue mix looks like. And so I'm going to turn off my microphone because my computer's buzzing, and let Kim and her reporter outer kind of move it from here.
All right, well, we had a very robust discussion in our group, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Jessica, who took the notes for everybody, to talk about what we discussed and what we came up as a potential, I wouldn't say a solution, but suggestions, since we're consultants, what our suggestions are. Go ahead, Jessica.
That's right. Thanks, Kim. So our very first takeaway looking at the overview of this organization is we feel really strongly that they need to do some analysis of their staff and find a way to put someone on staff with their eyes on development, whether that means reassigning people, shifting responsibilities, which is probably what it means. If they're struggling with cash flow, they don't really have someone, they don't really have the ability to hire someone new now, but we felt like that was really key. And the evidence for that was that they're not really doing direct asks, even of people who are clearly interested and invested in their mission. They're not having great success with foundations, both from the perspective of writing successful grants that get awarded and identifying grant opportunities that don't have a lot of strings attached, but provide some of that more flexible funding. And also the board seems to not be completely on board with the mission, that they need someone who can help communicate the need for board support and enforce the board's support, sort of provide lots of tools and encouragement to get them on board. So we felt like finding someone on staff who can have eyes on development, who can develop some expertise in handling those things is really key. We were also interested in the community training, the fee for service element, and felt like that was something that needed some review and some analysis to determine either, is it something that it can be made profitable and therefore can be done more often? The sort of outline said that it's not done very regularly, and when it is, it's mostly profitable. So can those modifiers be made more certain that it is done regularly and it is profitable? Or is it something that sucks a lot of staff time for minimal output? Should it be eliminated or revamped so that it is not such a draw on time? So we had some other things in there that we felt like were important, like it seems like maybe spend some time on refining their message and being sure that it is clear to stakeholders in the community what they do, why it's valuable, why it's fundable, would go a long way. Those words would go a long way towards their foundation efforts, and engaging corporate donors, which is an area that doesn't seem to necessarily be on their radar. Again, someone with an eye on development could help with that. We felt in terms of the pie chart that we would like to see them cut their gut reliance on government funding down to closer to 50%, which is a big change, but could also help free some of the staff from the really onerous reporting that comes along with some of those, the grants that are less autonomous and are also shrinking that we could free some of that staff time to then increase both the number and the percentage or success rate with the foundation applications and some corporate sponsorships, as well as increasing those individual gifts by managing the portfolio of volunteers and clients in a way that they are kept in the loop through communication. Someone brought up the great point of through communicating regularly with your stakeholders, the impact you're having as well as the need that you have to continue to grow those gifts and grow those relationships. I'm scanning my notes to see what else we felt.
I want to make sure I understand. Y'all are proposing, if we looked at this pie, that to not to get rid of government grants, because this is a reliable source, even though they do have one, as we said in the notes, more autonomous, which is a win for them, and a couple that are reliable but not very autonomous. So it is their largest chunk, but really kind of changing the mix of this, but you're going to double down on the foundations. And so I'm just want to check your math on that. We know that they haven't been very successful in this. And then one of the data points is when it's available, it's typically not very autonomous, i.e. it's not really, the margins are not accruing to capital to invest in innovation growth or innovation or growth. It seems like if they are not very autonomous, they are really on the budget side, kind of covering costs and delivering mission, which isn't bad. But is that your recommendation, that you would want more of that versus more of the donations and maybe fee for service? Just check.
Yeah, so it sounds like our reading is maybe not your intention, that our reading of that was partly that it means that they're maybe not applying to the right funders, that they need some expertise in choosing foundation applications and crafting the ask so that they're more successful more of the time and are accessing foundation support that is more autonomous and more useful.
Got it. Understood. Okay, that's very helpful. In terms of how they would, did y'all get into a discussion about what they needed to do from an internal perspective? Are some of these the same, or are they going to have to kind of reinvent their staffing model to get at that? You mentioned a fundraiser, right?
Yeah, so we felt like the staff needed some reorganization or some analysis, that we weren't 100% clear, obviously, with like a 30,000 foot view. You don't know, like, what are the staff doing? Is their time being spent well? Are they spending a lot of time spinning their wheels on things that aren't working? How can that be more efficiently aligned? So you do have someone who has development on their mind, and also help the staff as a whole understand the revenue model. And things like, someone brought up the point, they have 100 dedicated volunteers who are invested in the mission, and can we help the people who are managing those relationships, give them some tools to be able to communicate need and be able to communicate where the money is coming from and how it's being spent well, to loop those people, to loop volunteers and engage them in another axis of support. And we also mentioned that the staff their salaries have been flat. They do have some benefits, but it's not what we would call a generous benefits package. That in order to maintain the staff, to prevent burnout and attrition, it is important to be able to build some strategic capacity in the staff themselves to help, and even just give a vision of saying, it is on our radar that you need advancement. We want to support you. Here is where we are going as an organization to put us in a place to provide you a more robust benefits package, or whatever the things are, but to loop the staff into the process so that it is part of a staff strategic revenue plan together, and not alienating them or further making them feel overworked and undercompensated.
That makes a lot of sense. Any other questions from our group to this group? Any other suggestions that we might recommend, or questions that you might have about their recommendations? Feel free to unmute. They got it perfect. Case study group 2.
Great. We should all go be consultants.
I think you should.
We're very
You
good at
should.
this.
No, it was some good work, really good, thoughtful work. Let's move now for a moment to case study 2. So we'll put that up and kind of review it a bit. So we had a school enrichment program. It's kind of a startup, if you will. It's not completely new. It's been going because they do have outcomes. They have so, at 4 FTEs, they have a number of part-time staff. They don't really have any benefits to speak of. They're plowing all their money into just expansion right now, getting more, bandwidth. You can see that by the number of part-time staff. So we would call this a small agency. It's not really grassroots because they also have some substantial multi-year commitments from family foundations. We'll see that in a minute. And they have some government grants. So they've been successful in at least one government grant. And what we know about the government grants that they particularly go for in education is that the macro pie is decreasing overall, but the outcomes of their program are really compelling. And they could be competitive for additional government dollars, given that they have those outcomes. There are competitors that they are very similar to them, but they actually have very different approaches. So they're addressing the same needs. That's what I mean by similar in terms of the groups that they're going after, but they have very different approaches. And they're still small. They've gotten some initial funding, but it's still experimental in terms of how they're creating their revenue mix. And they have a founder that had high value connections in the community and some really good corporate connections. So that's kind of their scenario, and their mix kind of looks like this. It's pretty diverse right now because they're trying on a lot of stuff, but you can see their small government grant here, or their government grant is a small portion. They've got some partnerships. They're leveraging those individual community relationships and some of the corporate that they got, but the lion's share are these startup funders that they have, and they're multi-year, fairly reliable. We could have a scenario, I think we discussed, where those might taper or where those might double down. We're unsure, but it's a large amount of their mix. And I'm going to hand it to Jonathan to talk a little bit more about where we got to with the decisions about what we think they ought to do about this mix and some of the infrastructure stuff they ought to think about related.
Sure. So we discussed quite a few things. Hopefully my bullet points make sense, but just kind of some initial considerations and thoughts right off the bat. This organization should definitely be aware, of their kind of small capacity and then being kind of a startup, and careful about diversifying. I think looking at the pie chart, you immediately want to say they should diversify, but being, cautious about that. Couple of challenges. So just again, with the small capacity, stewarding individuals could be pretty time consuming, and family foundation stewardship kind of falls in that bucket as well. Another challenge might be if you're looking at the government pie, a lot of bandwidth would be needed for that. So again, they have a pretty small staff. An opportunity that we saw, they had really strong outcomes with their program. So, kind of emphasizing that story. We thought that maybe a government opportunity could really grow their capacity. So flexing those outcomes again. Again, balancing that with the low staff and capacity. So they would like to grow their employee base and they don't offer benefits, but a government funding could really bring some more impact there. And maybe someone had mentioned maybe bringing a government grant manager on to do that. So that would be a big growth for them. Let's see. This is more under the considerations too, just kind of keeping in mind that back end work that's needed. I think I've already talked about that a little bit, but strategizing their staff workload. So again, someone who could maybe do grants management, government grants, or someone who could be in charge of corporate and partnerships, that area, just being really intentional there. Then we kind of went into what recommendations we would make as the consultants. Maybe growing government, but being careful, not too many government departments. So, if you've got federal, state, local governments all falling on your lap, that could be a huge bandwidth challenge. If they're looking to change that concentration, maybe increasing corporate funding is a big opportunity for them. The founder had a lot of strong relationships in that area, so growing that a little bit more. Someone had mentioned too that if you grow really any pieces of the pie, you're going to shrink family foundations, and to be careful with that, because in the prompt, it said that some of the family foundations were multi-year, which points to that kind of reliability term that we learned about. So, still keeping those family foundations in the loop. What steps should they take? So stewardship being huge, being young like they are, but having all these successes to talk about. So just, always having that as part of their plan, strong stewardship, and, also being young, making sure that they're really working on developing their brand and marketing strategies too, because they've got a lot to talk about. Karen had introduced something that I had not heard of, but doing an investor briefing, which would be conversations with, the different family foundations or corporate folks, others they work with, to describe those strong outcomes, and the outcomes that could result from investments from these funders. And that could also kind of leverage the founder and his connections as well. The last thing we touched on was if we had any kind of board recommendations, especially with them being so new. Pointed out that, upstart boards can sometimes be more working boards and not have that experience with governance or with fundraising, especially. So using their kind of work experience and work connections through whatever sector they're in, to leverage relationships, and then obviously growing their capacity in other ways, and all the things that a board should be doing, like governance and fundraising. I think that was about it. I guess on the board side of things too, if you could identify corporate individuals for the board, just to get into that piece of the pie, and then ditto for government, particularly with the state and local individuals in the government arena. Someone in the group mentioned that, having those kind of more local folks that are close by would be a good way to get your foot in the door as a young organization. Did I miss anything, team?
I think you did a great job, Jonathan. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. So how would y'all like to see what actually happened to these groups when they worked through the consulting? Yeah. So let's look at case study 1 and kind of look at really actually what happened in real life. So over here we have the previous pie chart, and you'll note one big change. These foundation grants sort of really dissipated over time. And the thinking there by them was that particularly these fee for service, they focused on, so you'll see that going from 4% to 16%, the largest increase. And so they had high margins of revenue there, and it was very mission centric. And then they had high margins, so autonomous revenue spewing out of that. They hadn't really considered kind of doubling down on that, and it became a larger and larger component of their program, but also their revenue. And remember, autonomous revenue is relatively unencumbered, and so it allows them to invest in other areas, capacity for government, capacity for increasing the staffing needed to go after donations. And I wanted to cover that orange piece, donations, and why they felt that was more fruitful for them than foundations. They really thought about that as a investment partners. And so they had, as you recall, I got to go back to my original component. They had a number of volunteers and were able, as they increased their program, to have even more of those. And they had never asked them to donate. And so they saw this foundation group as not only low autonomy, but they weren't being very successful. They had a lot of competition and it was constantly going to the direct service providers. And so they thought this is sort of some blue ocean, if you will. And they created staffing and the ability to kind of go after not just small gifts here, but kind of some major gifts. And that translated for them into, they took what they, the capacity they had here on the foundation side and really kind of centered it into going after those donations and expanding that pool. And you can kind of see from 6 to 19%. So they've increased, effectively this component of the pie, redeployed some of those assets. We can argue with that. I'm just showing you what happened. And it has kind of recalibrated what their reliable government sources, the mix on that, the percentage, and they have an increasing percentage of these two areas. So that's kind of the story of that. Does anybody have any reflections or insight or commentary about kind of what actually happened with this particular client? It's kind of hard to give up a foundation, 16% foundation pie piece, but they were pretty bold.
Well, it was obvious they needed to do something differently or give something up or change their focus on how their resources were being used. And while that's not one that we really talked about, it makes sense when you think about it, that we had talked about either doing away with or increasing their fee for service, that it needed attention one way or another. So
right.
It makes a lot of sense.
I think the bottom line here is like, let's look at this green piece. It's very reliable, but there's not, again, government money often does not create, is not very autonomous, right? You're paying bills and expenses and some of your operating related, but it doesn't spew a lot of capital to be able to do reinvestments in capacity or innovation and that kind of thing. And these, we know from their foundation grants, from what they were described, they're not autonomous at all. So that's also not creating that kind of investment capital to grow, right? And so these are so small, they don't have any capital out of this maroon, the foundation and the government. What's similar about both of those pie pieces is they're both low autonomy. They don't have a lot of capital to reinvest in anything new. And so really they're going to sit here. That's what's going to happen. They're going to sit here and maybe they'll get another government grant or whatever. They do have a little bit of autonomous money out of one of their government grants. And so what they really needed to do was invest. They needed to change and take the capacity that that was hung up in this, delivering this 16% and reinvest it in something that could actually grow. And that was their decision. And it paid off. They're growing. This will continue to grow. They have their reliable source and they're moving on. Does that make sense? So they had to make a decision because the way their money was, they just a lot of reliable, but not autonomous. They just didn't have a lot of capital to grow. So they made the decision to kill something in order to reinvest those resources in something that could grow. Am I making sense there? Yeah.
The other thing I think is interesting is obviously they had a multi-year strategy, because while they eventually went away from foundations totally, it looks like they needed some key foundation investment in the beginning in order to actually get them to the point of not needing foundations. And like their initial hire was a grant writer to help them get some foundation money that
Exactly.
ended up letting them pivot away from it. So it's just interesting because it highlights that you might, like your strategy might look different in year 1 and 2 than in year 3, 4, 5, 6, etc.
Right. And you're making the best point ever. It's a strategy, right? It's not a knee jerk. So you have to move to it. You can't just kill and just say, well, we just don't even want any of your foundation money to do that. Maybe you're having a different conversation with those foundations about what you need to be able to do, or you're going after some capacity building kind of investments to position yourself there. But over time, I think the point here, this is, this is one time, this is a point in time in the future of what it looks like now. So there's a journey to this, right? But what they knew was they were never going to grow if they just kept the pie as it was. They were going to have to invest in these areas that could, in fact, grow and differentiate themselves. So it's different for everybody, like I said, but I thought it was interesting, for y'all to kind of see what actually really happened with the client.
I think it's impressive that they were able to increase donations up to 19%, right? That's, from 4% to 19%. That's really great.
Right.
And boy, that gives a lot more flexibility for sure.
Absolutely. And, they hadn't really tried. So that was just low hanging fruit. They had people that were engaged, but they hadn't asked. So that's where they went. Let's look at scenario number 2. This is where we were. And again, this is an upstart. So they're trying on some things. They've got some early for a moment, reliable, sources, and then they're trying some things, right? And they've got some good results. So, in terms of what they did, they convened their funders. They did an investor briefing. They really approached individual giving as an investment. So they were making the case that, here's our outcomes and they have an economic benefit for, educational preparedness, workforce development, all of that kind of stuff. And they sought, again, stable commitments over time. So they're looking for larger investments, over $1,000, big kind of major gifts from individuals. They had invested resources in developing their marketing and brand, because they are in a situation where they seem similar to others in community, but they actually have a very unique approach and very promising outcomes. And so talking about those and really kind of getting an investment deck together and really articulating themselves as that investment is what they did. And then they completely redesigned the board, as Jonathan said, from a working board to more of a governance board with a deeper civic reach, because they were very much going after, as you can tell, both the corporate area, but also trying to increase their individuals that they had access to, but definitely this corporate mix here. And then last, engaging staff from grant maker and affinity groups, i.e. education funders, and really thinking through what that meant for them, particularly as it pertained to government grants. And in this particular group, as you will recall, the government sources that they had were really declining year over year, but they had an opportunity to expand within them anyway. And so really a hyper focus on a certain kind of government grant, not just government grants writ large, and overwhelming themselves with the back end necessary to run those, to really build an efficient model of understanding exactly the kinds of government grants they were going after, having the staffing and accounting and reporting relative to that, and really putting their energy into this mix of individual, corporate, and the family foundations is where they went with that. Any reactions to that?
Do you have numbers on relative size of income between one model and another? What sort of income growth?
Not on these slides, but I mean, these are growth stories. And so what we're doing is talking about in this particular presentation, the mix, but of course you want to see the volume. So if this was a column, you'd want to see the column going up as well, right? These amounts going up, right? So it's not just the mix here, but you would want to see the amount of money also in growth, obviously, because they're trying to grow, right? So I thought you might be interested in just their decision making and what happened, with those particular, this is a small organization, and so you're not really getting rid of a pie piece, but I could see over time, if these partnerships really took up a lot of time, maybe they would diminish. But there is a similarity in infrastructure between partnerships and corporate partnerships or corporate grants. There's a lot of similarity in the way that looks behind the scenes in terms of cultivation and sales and stewardship and all of that. So, summary for this, first it starts with understanding your cost, and it's the delivery cost of your mission, of course, but it's the cost of these revenue sources and what that means to direct and indirect and expansion, what it would take to get to a different level of that. We just saw an example of where, we went from 6% to 15% in government. That's, a material change that could, from an infrastructure or cost perspective, quite materially shift what was happening internally, particularly as they were used to kind of stewarding mostly foundations that didn't have all that rigor. So you really kind of look at that and look at scenarios as you increase what happens to your indirect costs, what happens to your directs, but understanding costs, analyzing your current mix, your costs, your reliability, your autonomy. I can't stress that enough. Reliability, autonomy, know where those things are and what you're trading for each one. Or new revenue sources, what you're distracting and trading for that. You wouldn't want to get rid of a reliable source just because it was hard. You might want to, but you also need autonomous sources to be able to spew that type of margin that you can reinvest in capitalizing staff, technology, innovation, new sources of revenue. You have to have that. It can't just come from reliable sources. You've got to analyze these opportunities in that way and then cost implement, assess your capacity requirements to shift, the journey towards that shift. It's not a knee jerk, it's a journey. Write it down, communicate it, and not just internally, but internal is super critical, but to your investors themselves. And then of course, track it, monitor it, and adjust.